The year was 1944, and the city of Manila was a suffocating tomb of humidity and fear. Beneath the canopy of the relentless tropical sun, the streets of the Pearl of the Orient were no longer filled with the vibrant laughter of the marketplace, but with the rhythmic, heavy thud of jack boots on cobblestone. The Imperial Japanese Army had entrenched itself like a parasite, turning grand colonial mansions and quiet residential districts into fortresses of interrogation and debauchery. In the heart of the Malat district, a group of soldiers from the 14th Area Army occupied a sprawling estate that had once belonged to a wealthy Spanish merchant family. They moved through the halls with the casual indifference of men who believed they had conquered not just a territory, but the very soul of the people living within it. For the women forced to clean their boots and scrub their floors, the world had shrunk to the size of a single room, a space where every breath was a gamble and every glance was a potential death sentence. The air was thick with the smell of stagnant water, cheap cigarettes, and the metallic tang of fear that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the city. Among these women was Maria, a name that carried the weight of 1,000 silent prayers. She had once been a student of medicine, a girl whose hands were meant for healing, not for the grim work of survival. She had watched the smoke rise from the ruins of her father's tailoring shop, and she had felt the cold steel of a bayonet against her ribs when the soldiers came to collect their tribute. But Maria was more than the submissive servant she pretended to be. She was a ghost in the making, a silent observer of the routines that governed the lives of her captors. The Japanese soldiers were disciplined in combat, but in the sweltering heat of the Philippines, they sought refuge in the familiar comforts of home. They craved the ritual of the bath, a practice that they believed cleansed the spirit as much as the body. It was this craving, this singular moment of perceived safety, that Maria and her sisters in shadows began to study with a cold, analytical precision. They noted the times, the rotation of the guards, and most importantly, the psychological shift that occurred when a soldier stripped away his uniform and his weapons. The arrogance of the occupier is a peculiar kind of blindness. To the soldiers of the emperor, the Filipino women were nothing more than background noise, as insignificant as the flies buzzing around the rotting fruit in the courtyard. They called them native pigs' names that were spat out with the same casual cruelty they used to kick a stray dog. They assumed that because these women had been broken by hunger and loss, they were incapable of resistance. But in the dim light of the kitchens and the damp corners of the laundry rooms, a different kind of fire was being stoked. The heresy of their plan lay in its simplicity. They did not need rifles they did not have, or explosives they could not build. They needed only the laws of physics, the element of surprise, and the absolute certainty that they were already dead in the eyes of the world. They were prepared to use the very rituals of their oppressors against them, turning a place of relaxation into a slaughterhouse without firing a single shot. The abyss had stared back at them for too long, and now they were preparing to step into it and drag their tormentors down with them. The bathhouse at the Malate estate was a converted carriage house, a structure of heavy timber and stone floors that stayed cool even in the midday sun. Inside, the soldiers had installed large, deep wooden tubs, some capable of holding multiple men at once. The air was thick with the scent of cedar and the rising steam from the charcoal braziers used to heat the water. It was a sensory environment that muffled sound and blurred vision, a perfect trap for anyone who felt too comfortable. Maria and 4 others were tasked with maintaining the water levels and providing the towels and scrubbing brushes. They moved with a practiced robotic efficiency, keeping their heads low and their eyes averted. To the soldiers, they were merely extensions of the furniture tools to be used and discarded. But as the heat of late October pressed down on Manila, The frequency of these bathing sessions increased, and the guards grew lax, often leaving their posts to smoke or nap in the shade of the mango trees nearby. The soldiers would laugh and splash water at the women, mocking their silence, unaware that every droplet of water was a countdown to their own end. The technical challenge was significant. A grown man, even one exhausted by the rigors of a tropical campaign, is a formidable opponent when fighting for his life. Maria understood that they could not rely on strength alone. They needed leverage. They needed the water itself to be their ally. They began to experiment in secret testing, the weight of water-filled buckets, and the slickness of the soap they were given to use. They learned how a body moves when it is submerged, how the panic of drowning can be harnessed if the initial strike is swift and silent. They were not just planning a murder, they were designing a system of execution. Every movement was choreographed, every position calculated to ensure that when the moment came, there would be no splash loud enough to alert the guards outside. They were preparing to drown the wolf in his own den, using the steam to hide their faces and the silence to amplify their resolve. It was a cold, calculated heresy against the traditional rules of warfare, a rebellion born of desperation and the absolute lack of any other option. As the day of the operation approached, the atmosphere in the estate became electric, with a tension that only the conspirators could feel. The soldiers were boisterous, celebrating a recent minor victory in the northern provinces, with extra rations of sake. They were louder than usual, their laughter echoing through the stone corridors like the barking of hyenas. Maria felt the weight of the task ahead, pressing against her chest like a physical stone. She knew that if they failed, the retribution would be swift and unimaginable, not just for them, but for every civilian within a 5-mile radius. Yet the memory of her brother's face, cold and blue in the mud of a roadside ditch, provided a chilling clarity. The heresy was no longer a plan, it was an inevitability. They would become the nightmares that the Japanese soldiers thought they had left behind in the jungles. They would prove that the most dangerous weapon in 1944 was not a tank or a plane, but a woman who had nothing left to lose, and a deep abiding knowledge of the water. The architecture of the bathhouse played a crucial role in their strategy. The floor was tilted slightly for drainage, leading to a central grate that was often slick with algae and soap scum. By strategically placing extra buckets and stools, they could create a maze that would hinder any soldier attempting to scramble out of a tub in a panic. They practiced the grip the specific way to clasp a man's head and shoulders to force him downward, while using their own body weight as an anchor. It was a grim mechanical training performed in whispers during the few hours of the night when the estate was relatively quiet. They were no longer the victims of the occupation, they were the engineers of its demise. Each woman was assigned a specific tub and a specific target, based on the rotation they had observed over the past 2 weeks. They were waiting for the perfect storm of heat drunkenness and the absence of the commanding officers, a confluence of factors that would leave the rank and file soldiers at their most vulnerable. The psychological toll of this preparation was immense. Maria found herself looking at the soldiers not as human beings, but as anatomical puzzles to be solved. She studied the veins in their necks, the strength of their shoulder blades, and the way they leaned back in the tubs with their eyes closed. She watched them splash water into each other's faces with the playfulness of children, a sight that would have been innocent in any other context. But here, in the middle of a brutal occupation, it was a reminder of their utter disregard for the lives they were destroying. Every time a soldier called her a native pig, every time he forced her to scrub his back until her knuckles bled, the resolve in her heart hardened into diamond. The slaughter was coming, and it would be as silent as the mist rising from the Pasig River at dawn. They were ready to turn the pride of the Imperial Japanese Army into a collection of bloated corpses, proving that even in the darkest abyss, The spirit of resistance can find a way to strike back with terrifying efficiency. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon on that fateful Tuesday, the humidity had reached a breaking point. The air felt like a wet wool blanket, heavy and suffocating. 16 Japanese soldiers, many of them already swaying from the effects of the sake they had consumed during the afternoon, marched toward the bathhouse. They were shouting, singing patriotic songs of the rising sun, their voices harsh and discordant in the quiet of the estate. They dropped their rifles by the door, a pile of wood and steel that they assumed they would never need in this sanctuary of steam. They stripped off their sweat-stained uniforms, revealing bodies that were lean and scarred from years of conflict across the Pacific. They stepped into the warm water with sighs of relief, letting the heat soak into their tired muscles. Mariah stood in the corner, a stack of clean towels in her arms, her face a mask of perfect subservient obedience. Beside her stood Elena Rosa and Isabel, their eyes meeting for a brief, a terrifying second before they focused on their assigned tubs. The steam began to rise in thick white clouds, obscuring the ceiling and turning the soldiers into ghostly silhouettes. The sound of water lapping against the sides of the tubs filled the room, a rhythmic, hypnotic sound that seemed to lull the men into a false sense of security. Maria watched as the sergeant, a man with a thick neck and a cruel scar across his cheek, leaned back and closed his eyes. He let out a long, satisfied breath, his hands resting limply on the edge of the wooden tub. This was the moment. The silence of the room was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the charcoal in the braziers. Outside, the world was moving toward its own destruction, with the American forces drawing closer to the beaches of Leyte. But inside this small, humid room, the war had narrowed down to a single point of impact. The heresy was about to meet the crucible of action, and the women of Manila were about to reclaim their city, one life at a time. The water was ready, the steam was thick, and the ghosts of the fallen were watching from the shadows, waiting for the first splash that would signal the beginning of the end. The bucket's impact with the stone floor was the crack of a whip that shattered the silence of the Malate estate. In that fraction of a second, the world of the bathhouse shifted from a sanctuary of steam to a theater of primitive, desperate violence. Maria's hands, once trained for the delicate touch of a physician, locked onto the sergeant's head with a strength born of 3 years of accumulated hatred. She did not just push, she threw the entire weight of her soul into the movement, driving his face deep into the scalding water. The sergeant caught in the blissful lethargy of the heat, and the sack reacted with the instinctive explosive power of a trapped animal. His eyes snapped open under the surface, a blur of white and red through the distorted medium of the water. He tried to lunge upward, his thick muscles bunching like iron cables, but the wooden edge of the tub and Maria's braced position gave her the leverage she had calculated so carefully during those long, sleepless nights in the laundry room. The physical reality of drowning a man is not the quick cinematic affair portrayed in stories. It is a grueling, exhausting struggle against the body's refusal to die. Maria felt the sergeant's fingers clawing at her forearms, his nails digging deep into her skin as he searched for a grip. The water splashed over the sides of the tub, mixing with the sweat and the soap on the floor. To her left, Elena was engaged in a similar life and death struggle, with a corporal whose frantic thrashing sent a heavy wooden stool skittering across the room. The air was filled with the sound of muffled gurgling and the rhythmic thud of heels against the bottom of the tubs. It was a chaotic, wet percussion that seemed to last for hours, though in reality only seconds had passed. Maria grit her teeth, her lungs burning from the effort, her vision narrowing until all she could see was the back of the sergeant's head and the bubbles rising from his desperate final exhales. She was no longer a girl from Manila. She was an instrument of the gravity and the fluid that was slowly extinguishing the fire of his life. A few tubs away, the situation began to spiral into a dangerous uncertainty. One of the younger soldiers, a private who had been less intoxicated than the others, managed to slip sideways as Rosa lunged for him. He surfaced with a gasp, his eyes wide with terror, as he realized his world had turned into a nightmare. He tried to shout, but Isabel, moving with the speed of a striking cobra, slammed a heavy ceramic water jar against his temple. The sound of the impact was a sickening crunch that echoed through the steam-filled room. The soldier collapsed back into the water. His consciousness shattered his body, becoming a dead weight for the pool to consume. But the noise had been too loud. Outside, a sentry paused in his patrol, his ears pricking up at the unfamiliar sound. He took a step toward the carriage house, his hand reaching for the bolt of his Arisaka rifle. Inside, Maria heard the crunch of gravel and felt a cold spike of adrenaline. The crucible was testing them, demanding to know if their resolve could withstand the intrusion of the outside world. The sentry leaned his head toward the heavy timber doors, calling out a question in Japanese. The women froze, their hearts hammering against their ribs. Maria kept her weight pressed firmly against the sergeant, whose movements had slowed to a weak rhythmic twitching. She looked toward the door, her mind racing through the thousands of ways this could end in their execution. Elena, realizing the danger, began to laugh. It was a high, forced sound, a mimicry of the playful banter the soldiers often forced upon them. She splashed the water loudly and called out a few broken phrases of Japanese she had picked up, gesturing for the others to join in. The other women followed suit, creating a wall of sound that masked the grim work being done beneath the surface of the water. The sentry hesitated, then let out a low, amused chuckle, likely assuming the soldiers were having their way with the servants. He turned and resumed his walk, the sound of his footsteps fading back into the humid afternoon air. The crisis had passed, but the cost had been a precious reserve of energy that they still desperately needed. The sergeant beneath Maria was finally still. The bubbles had stopped, and his body had gone from a coiled spring of resistance to a heavy, inert mass of meat. She did not let go. She held him down for another full minute, ensuring that the cold hand of the abyss had firmly taken hold. Her arms were shaking, the muscles twitching with fatigue, and the scratches on her skin were burning from the salt in the soap. She looked around the room, her eyes stinging from the steam and the sweat. The other tubs were also becoming quiet. Elena was leaning against her tub, gasping for air, her face pale as a ghost. Rosa and Isabel were working together to ensure the last of their targets had been neutralized. 16 men, the pride of the 14th Area Army, were now nothing more than submerged obstacles in their own bathhouse. The first phase of the slaughter was complete, but the room was now a tomb, and the weight of what they had done began to settle over them like a shroud of lead. The transition from the struggle to the aftermath was a descent into a new kind of horror. The water in the tubs was no longer clear. It was clouded with the discharge of dying bodies and the remnants of the soap that had been their silent ally. The smell of cedar had been replaced by the pungent copper scent of blood, where fingernails had found flesh, and the underlying stench of sudden violent death. Maria stepped back from the tub, her legs feeling like water. She looked at her hands, the hands that had once hoped to hold a scalpel or a newborn child, and she saw the bruises and the blood of her enemy. There was no triumph in this moment, only a profound, hollow exhaustion. They had committed a slaughter that would be talked about in hushed tones for decades, a massacre of the naked and the vulnerable. But as she looked at the uniforms piled by the door, she knew that these men had forfeited their right to a soldier's death the moment they stepped onto Philippine soil as conquerors. The slaughter reached its climax, not in the act of drowning, but in the cold, systematic check that followed. They moved from tub to tub, ensuring that no man was merely unconscious. It was a grim, repetitive task that stripped away the last vestiges of their innocence. They used the heavy scrubbing brushes and the wooden stools to ensure that the work of the water was final. There was a mechanical quality to their movements, now a detachment that was necessary for survival. They were no longer the women of Malate. They were the ghosts of the occupation, reclaiming the city through a baptism of blood and steam. The steam itself seemed to thicken, as if trying to hide the scene from the eyes of God. The charcoal in the braziers was dying down the orange glow, fading into gray ash, mirroring the life force that had been drained from the room. They had turned a place of luxury into a monument of retribution, a slaughterhouse where the only sound was the drip of water from the ceiling and the heavy, ragged breathing of the survivors. They began the process of cleaning the room, a twisted parody of the chores they had performed every day for the past 2 years. They straightened the stools, folded the clean towels, and wiped down the edges of the tubs. They wanted the scene to look as undisturbed as possible from a distance, a tableau of a tragic sake-fueled accident, or a mass suicide, though they knew the Japanese investigators would eventually see through the deception. But they only needed enough time to escape the estate and vanish into the labyrinthine slums of Manila. They stripped off their own wet, bloodied garments and changed into the simple cotton dresses they had hidden beneath the laundry piles. They moved with a silent, urgent precision, their eyes constantly darting toward the doors. Every shadow seemed to hold a bayonet. Every sound of the wind was a shouted command. The slaughter was over, but the hunt was about to begin, and the ghosts they had created would be the only ones left to testify to what had happened in the humid darkness of the carriage house. The escape from the Malate estate was a journey through a landscape of nightmares. They moved through the back garden, staying in the deep shadows of the hibiscus and bougainvillea. The air outside felt strangely cold against their skin, a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat of the bathhouse. They could hear the distant sounds of the city, the rumble of Japanese trucks, and the occasional crack of a rifle, reminders that they were still in the heart of enemy territory. Maria led the way, her knowledge of the estate's layout providing a narrow path to freedom. They reached the back wall, a structure of crumbling stone covered in vines. One by one, they scrambled over their fingers, bleeding as they gripped the jagged rocks. They dropped into the muddy alleyway on the other side, the filth of the street a welcome embrace after the sterilized horror of the bathhouse. They were out, but the weight of the 16 souls they had taken followed them like a physical presence, a collection of invisible anchors that would drag at them for the rest of their lives. In the days that followed, the story of the bathhouse massacre spread through the underground of Manila like a wildfire. It became a legend, a whispered tale of vengeance that gave hope to a starving, battered population. The Japanese authorities reacted with a predictable, savage brutality, rounding up hundreds of civilians and executing them in the streets. But they could never find the women responsible. Maria Elena Rosa and Isabel had become phantoms, disappearing into the vast, churning sea of the Philippine resistance. They moved from safe house to safe house, their identities erased by the chaos of the war. They became known only as the Bathhouse Butchers, a name that struck fear into the hearts of the Japanese garrison and became a rallying cry for the guerrillas in the mountains. They had proven that the Japanese were not invincible, that even in their most intimate moments, they were vulnerable to the rage of those they oppressed. The statistics of the event were recorded in the secret journals of the resistance and the official reports of the Imperial Japanese Army. 16 soldiers, including 1 sergeant and 3 corporals, found dead in a single afternoon. No shots fired, no explosives used, just the silence of the water and the resolve of 5 women. The 14th Area Army was humiliated, the story of their soldiers being drowned by native pigs, being a stain on their honor that they could never scrub away. They increased the guards at every bathhouse in the city, turning their places of relaxation into armed camps, a move that only served to further demoralize the troops, who were already feeling the pressure of the advancing American forces. The massacre had a psychological impact that far outweighed its tactical significance, creating a climate of paranoia and mistrust that ate away at the foundation of the occupation from the inside out. But for Maria, the war did not end with the liberation of Manila in 1945. The ghosts of the bathhouse followed her into the peace that followed. She returned to her medical studies, eventually becoming a doctor in a small village in the northern provinces. She spent her life healing the wounds of others, perhaps as a way to balance the scales for the lives she had taken in the steam of Malate. She never married, and she rarely spoke of the war, but those who knew her well noticed that she could never be in a room with a boiling kettle or a steaming tub without a look of profound, haunting sadness crossing her face. She had survived the abyss, but she had brought a part of it back with her, a coldness in her soul that no tropical sun could ever truly warm. She was a hero of the resistance, a woman who had done the impossible, but she was also a victim of the very violence she had used to save her people. The fate of the other women was equally shrouded in the mist of history. Elena was said to have joined the Hukbalahap, the communist guerrillas, who continued to fight long after the Japanese had surrendered. Rosa and Isabel vanished into the southern islands, their names lost to the changing tides of the post-war era. They were the silent architects of a moment of terrifying clarity, a moment when the power dynamics of the occupation were flipped on their head in a flurry of bubbles and wet stone. They were the reminders that the human spirit, when pushed to the absolute brink, can find a capacity for destruction that is as calculated as it is devastating. They were the ghosts in the machine of the Japanese war effort, a haunting presence that reminded every occupier that the people they tread upon are the ones most likely to pull them down into the mud. Today, the estate in Malate is a memory replaced by the glass and steel of modern Manila. The carriage house is gone, and the stone floors that once ran slick with the blood of the 14 Area Army have been buried under layers of asphalt and concrete. But if you stand on those streets during the height of the monsoon season, when the air is thick with steam and the sound of falling water drowns out the noise of the traffic, you can almost feel the presence of the 16. You can almost hear the muffled splash and the desperate gasps for air that marked the end of an era of arrogance. The ghosts of 1944 are still there, whispering the story of the women who refused to be pigs, the women who used the water to reclaim their dignity and their city. It is a story of horror and heroism, a dark chapter in the history of the Philippines, that proves that the most silent deaths are often the ones that echo the longest through the halls of time. The legacy of the bathhouse butchers is not one of monuments or medals, but of a quiet, enduring defiance. It is a story that reminds us that in the darkest crucibles of conflict, the smallest and most underestimated can become the most lethal. The 16 soldiers of the 14th Area Army are long forgotten by their country, their names lost to the vast tallies of the fallen in the Pacific War. But in the heart of Manila, their end remains a testament to the power of the oppressed. The water of the bathhouse was a mirror reflecting the true nature of the occupation and the inevitable result of its cruelty. It was a baptism of fire in a room full of steam, a moment of absolute truth that stripped away the uniforms and the titles to reveal the raw, bleeding heart of a nation that refused to die. The ghosts are still watching, and the water is still waiting, a silent reminder that the abyss always claims its due in the end.